hear old black guys play jazz. And I went to Preservation Hall. They're just great. You been there? Yeah. I mean, there's.
I used to go to Memphis all the time. When I was traveling, I always stopped
Oh,
in.
okay.
I'd always stop Mill Street.
Oh,
Away my meal time for that.
I've been there too. That is nice.
Memphis Music, which is a little record store. They'd always have this old black guy with a guitar out front. You know, he'd sit there and listen to it for a while. Of course, you'd have to buy a CD and a harmonica from him or something.
Yeah.
So,
Oh,
about 25.
oh, that blues harmonica? Wow. We're missing. Well, okay. All right. So global. Just a couple thoughts here in a general way. It's pretty much same setup as the other things we've looked at. But it's, in some ways, first of all, it's, as I've said before, some would argue that this is when enculturation begins as we become more globally conscious. But as we've seen, it's there from the start. That's kind of theologically naive to think it only started now. But you could say as we go through this, it forces us to think about, I mean, all of these things at the end. There's two dangers here, or one danger and one strength. The danger is, and I thought this is where we were going to go with this earlier, when we start bringing out these kind of different approaches to Christology or theology, like, you know, with the ellipse and you start moving the experience variable around, you can end up with a kind of balkanization of theology. You know, with the Balkans, every state its own and isolated. Where does this end? Does it end with every person has their own theology? Because every person's experience is different. So that's kind of the pushing it to the point where it's just highly problematic, I think. But I do think not every argument has to be the slippery slope, or not every slippery slope leads you off the roof. Sometimes there's an insight about, yep, experience matters, now let's figure out how to deal with this, rather than discount it altogether. But I am aware that it does, that's where it goes to this real fragmentation of theology, which is problematic. Now, some of that has to do with the pluralism I mentioned before, and this is the positive side of it, this broader realization, a richer sense of the nature of God, and the multiplicity of human cultures can lead to a deepening and a more profound sense of God's nature, which is what theology is about and what the church's witness should be about. So, you know, those two things in a way go hand in hand. You can't have the one without the other. The risk of fragmentation comes from taking other cultures seriously. Now, how do we talk to each other? And I've said before, I think that is the right problem to have. And when we think about the four marks of the church, okay, which are?
One, holy, Catholic, apostolic.
Okay, excellent, well taught. But the unity and the apostolicity are really variations on the same point. So apostolicity has to do with we are the same church, we are in communion with the apostles, okay? That's over time, unity over time. When we think about unity as the mark of the church, one, we tend to think of it as unity, you could say, across space. But they're really variations on the same point, which is how much difference can we have and still be one? And that requires real discernment about what is essential and what can be different. And I think for a lot of our history, in part because we didn't have that much experience of other cultures, we packed into the necessary unity all kinds of things which could probably differ. Some of that was because we just didn't know. So for instance, when in the United States earlier in the 20th century, as there were more immigrants, Catholic immigrants coming in from the Eastern Europe and the Byzantine church, right? Well, now there's the Orthodox Church, which is separate from Rome, and then there's the Eastern Rite Church that's affiliated with Rome, correct? So the Eastern Rite Church has its own canon law, and the operative issue here was the fact that their priests could marry. The U.S. bishops were concerned that if regular Catholics met Byzantine Catholics, and the Byzantine Catholics had married priests, it would well, as they always put it would scandalize the faithful. It would raise questions they don't want to talk about. It's the same thing. So they had, at least for a while, and I don't know how long or how extensively, but at least for a while, the idea that while it was okay for Byzantine Catholic priests to marry, when they came to the U.S., they couldn't, just so that they didn't have this confusion about what is real Catholic teaching, because that they were concerned that difference, some marry, some don't, would look like the church is divided. When everybody in Rome knew that difference existed, and we weren't divided, but they were afraid how that would play out on the practical level. So again, those same issues of practicality versus theology and so on. But the question that this pushes for us is what's similar, what can vary? And in some ways, and I acknowledge this is reductionistic, so don't read this too literally, but at the heart of what our message is, really the two distinctive Christian teachings, the Incarnation and the Trinity. And like Paul says, what we know is Christ and Him crucified. So we have the person and work of Jesus, so the Incarnation in the fullest sense of the term, as mid-20th century theologians refer to it, the Christ event, meaning from conception to ascension, all of that. So we have Christ, and then we have the nature of God as Trinitarian, both of which are problematic. Well, we read the essay about Islam in dealing with Islam. The divinity of Christ, which is related, of course, to the doctrine of the Trinity. How can we have unity? And I do think that what some of this decentering that we've talked about, the postmodern critique of the Enlightenment and so on, is related to or helping us recover, at least it has helped me recover. And that's really what it's all about. But I think it helps us recover the wonder of the mystery of the Trinity. And I said this at the beginning of the course, but at the end of the day, the doctrine of the Trinity says that there is genuine, real difference between these three persons. And that the reality of that difference, because they aren't just variations on a theme, it's not three different masks God puts on, etc. We worked that all through. But that the reality of that difference is not a threat to unity. Now that, to me, is a teaching that is profoundly true and deeply needed in the world today. And that if we as a church could figure out how to make the Trinity a real part, first of all, of the way we live as a church, with difference and unity, and then what we proclaim to the world, people would take notice, especially if it started with us living it out. And that difference need not be a threat. But then, so what's the extent of legitimate difference? I mean, it opens up a whole bunch of other questions. It addresses some and opens up others. But again, I think it opens up the right questions that we should be wrestling with here. Not whether difference is compatible with unity, but how much. What difference? So if someone is rejecting the divinity of Christ, then say, well, I'm sorry, that's not compatible with being in our church. But you reject, exactly where does that divide come? And I think that was something that the bishops were addressing in, you could say, in the Synod on the Family. They didn't put it quite that way, but still, what do we do? How significant is the reality of divorced and remarried Catholics? Does this mean they can't receive the Eucharist? Well, that's a question of what's the limit of our difference and our community? So, and I think this whole question of culture gets at that. One other thing, with a couple of variations here. I alluded to once before the idea that the sometimes evangelical chant that Jesus is the answer. Okay, totally agree with this. Jesus is the answer. I'm happy to chant that. The question is, what's the question? And so both Cook and Fawn ask at some point, and this is in a way very much like what I referred to once as second generation feminism. Remember, the first is women can do whatever men can do. And then the second is, why do men get to make the rules is what we have to do? We want to be part of making the rules. Well, you could almost see a kind of similar way of going through this with non-European cultures. Oh, we can be just as European as the rest, and we'll show you, we'll dress, we'll talk, we'll do all this. And at some point say, wait a minute, why do we have to be European to show we're truly Catholic or truly Christian? So now how can the non-white, non-Europeans generate new questions? So it isn't, and what both Fanon and Cook are pushing is that we don't just have new answers to the old European questions, but if we actually listen to people in these other cultures, we may have different questions, to which we believe Jesus is the answer. But this is going to be worked out in a different way. And that's the kind of radicality of it. So Cook says at one point, 668, we don't need to turn there, but he says at one point, what if Christ actually answers African questions? What would this look like? And he says that what we need, actually, let's, the closing, I think this is the closing, 692. Yeah, it's the last paragraph of his essay. And then we can work our way back to this. But just as a framework, and then I want to hear from some of you. But he's talking about an indigenous Christology. So indigenous, do you know what that word means? Like it's rooted in, like the native people, like the American Indians in the United States are indigenous people. They were here before others came in. So it's kind of in their own home. I do not believe that a Christology that is truly indigenous to either Latin America or Africa or Asia has yet emerged. But it must do so, lest Jesus remain forever the stranger who visits from the outside, but never lives within the unique and irreplaceable experience of the people. And he goes on and talks about a poor woman. But that idea of a truly indigenous Christology, and when you think about Gorenga, for instance, that essay about solidarity, when he puts the incarnation in terms of solidarity, what the incarnation is about God becoming one of us. Now, the question these folks are asking here, but you could also say in feminism and even Latin American liberation theology, is what is the antecedent of the pronoun us? To whom does us refer when Jesus has become one of us? Not simply a Jew. Now we add the Gentiles, but now we could say not simply a European, and not a white, not a male, all of us as human. So what does it mean if Jesus becomes Korean or Vietnamese or African? We may end up with some different ways of thinking than that he becomes a European. So that's one part. Cook makes the point in 678. Talks about translation. There we go. Looking at under the heading the independent experience. He says, liberation means independence from oppressive and alienating voices. It means a return to and repristination like making alive again, okay? Repristination of the originating experiences of Africa, not as a mere romantic retrieval of the past, but as a powerful symbolic experience to evoke a usable past, one that's creative of the future, a generativity. Okay, then he says, mere adaptation or translation still bears the mark of dependency. Now, I've used the term translation before, learning both languages as a positive thing. Here he's referring to this in a somewhat negative way, as mere translation. What's he concerned about in that?
We were just tell the same story.
Yes, that's right. And the story hasn't been changed to fit the new circumstances. That's right. So he doesn't want mere translation. Now, Fahn gets at this same point in, where is it? Oh, 424. Yeah. He uses this great image of a tree. But the transformative power of Asian Christology. It says, both the Christian, as Pearson's song repeatedly point out, both the Christian churches and their theologies are in Asia, but not of Asia. A similar kind of mirror translation point. Then he uses this great image. There's been a reluctance to break the pot in which Western Christianity has grown, and to let the Christian tree strike its roots deep in the Asian humus to become a native plant instead of growing like a stunted bonsai. So the image of we can bring in this tree in a pot and put it in the new culture of Asia someplace, China, Vietnam, Korea, set it there, but it's still bound up in that pot. If we break the pot and plant the tree in the soil of Vietnam and let it grow out of that soil, it may produce a fruit that is similar but different, fed by the rich soil of this culture. He said that's what we need to do somehow, is break the pot. And the pot for him is more the cultural constraint like of Europe. And again, this isn't to say that a European theology that's authentically European is anything wrong. Europeans no less worthy than anybody else, but it's also not more worthy. It's equal. So let's figure this out. In a way, you could say, as I've thought of this, so Christianity, crudely, goes north from Jerusalem up to Antioch, takes a left into the Roman Empire, right? Well, what if we'd gone up there and taken a right more into Central Asia? And, you know, however we formulated our creeds, it probably wouldn't be in the language of homoousios. It'd be Persian somehow, or Chinese, or who knows? It'd be something different. And now we'd be asking, how can those Europeans and their weird Platonic heritage make sense of this gospel that we teach? You know, the shoe would be on the other foot. And I'm not saying this is entirely an accident of history or anything. I have no idea, to be honest, how the Holy Spirit was involved in this and how necessary that was at the time. All I know is right now, we have a global church. And how do we deal with that? And so that's what they're both pushing. But that those images of translation isn't enough. It needs to really be rooted. We don't want Christ to remain a guest in these cultures. He needs to become kin, a brother, a native, African, Asian, whatever. And just to remind ourselves of what's going on, a native woman. And it's exactly the same logic for feminism as for these other cultures. How does Christ come in to an experience to which on the surface he seems alien? And that's the question. Okay, comments on the reading here that we've done. Let's hold off for a moment on the Islam. That's a totally different kind of question. That's more evangelization. We can deal with that quickly. But the Asian and African. Yeah.
Just to follow up on what this thing about indigenous Christology, I was thinking about how, I mean, to be truly indigenous, wouldn't it have been in Palestinian, Aramaic kind of?
Yeah.
And it got forced sort of right away into Hellenized.
Right, exactly. Very good. Keep going.
And so it really, I mean, that, and I guess that's sort of the basis to the European.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Or Western.
Western, yep.
But was it really, that's not really the Western view is not the indigenous.
Well, it's indigenous to the West.
To the West it is.
Right.
But to the original
I see what you mean,
play
right.
of-
That's, no, exactly, and that's the whole point of why I mean, you're making this point another way, but it's why that conversion of Cornelius and the whole Paul bringing the Gentiles in is so critical. It sets the pattern for the fact that you don't have to be Jewish to be Christian. And so the first example of exactly what they're talking about is our Christianity. We are an example of the gospel moving to an alien culture. Now, it's been in this alien culture. I mean, Karl Rahner talks about this. I might have alluded to this once before, but in an essay on Vatican II, he says this is opening up the third age of the church. And part of this was striking just the bishops who came and from all over the world. But the first age, and they are not at all equal in time, first age was the Jewish church, okay, less than a century. Second age is the European church. Third age, the global church. And that's dawning now. So what does this mean? And it is really what, as you know, what Catholic means. Universal, everywhere. And the challenges for the Catholic Church, and others deal with this, and I'm not pro-con, I'm just saying this is what I know and what we're talking about. But the Catholic Church, the question is, how can we be truly Catholic and not just European? So it's a question of our identity as Catholic, to not be an ethnic or a national church, even if that nation is the whole West, which is, a lot bigger than Norway, but it's still limited. So how to do that? And that's exactly the question. And to let this happen, there is a certain amount of letting go. I mean, Rahner also writes in his Foundations of Christianity about how when take the teaching authority seriously, which he really wants to do, and it's really important, and et cetera. Okay, all the necessary affirming statements. It's also the fact that no one person, even guided by the Holy Spirit, can master all these differences that are now part of the Catholic Church. And yet the Pope is in charge and has to rule on things. So this changes. There's got to be more listening. Because it's hard enough in the past for the Pope to just master European thought. That's small potatoes. Now you're talking about Ghana and Vietnam and Argentina and, South Sea Islands. I mean, these are just hardly variations on a theme. So how to deal with that and be one is the real challenge. And at the heart of that unity is Christ. And how do we understand Christ? So that's where this really bites. It's enough to say, well, what kind of music do we allow in the liturgy and all that? I mean, compared to this, I just think, it's just small potatoes. Okay, I'm not getting too worked up about this. I mean, I don't want to say it's not important, but that's way different than do we get rid of Christ or not? I mean, how do we understand this? Or as some of, Fawn was critical of some because they seem to question the divinity of Christ. Well, there are non-negotiables here. And how do we wrestle with that? And figuring out what is and what isn't non-negotiable, that's the big key, yeah. Others. So this whole picture from Asia, and, I don't want to put you three on the spot, but I will. And as we said last time, Asia's too big, so we could talk about your particular context. Does this make sense? Does it feel right? Does this guy know what he's talking about? How does this read to you?
I was very struck by that he's talking about we have already metacosmic religiousness.
Very good, yes.
In Yang, it's
Yeah.
It's totally rooted in our culture. Even Korean Catholics, when they choose the good place for living to dwell,
Yeah.
we always take account of yin and yang.
Okay, this is great,
So-
good.
Yeah, and so I think he explains well about non-Christian culture.
Okay, yeah,
So how Catholics
Yeah, no, very good, very good. So just for our online folks, the idea, Catherine from Korea saying that that Fan did a good job of describing the way this works in Korea, and that Korean Catholics think about things like yin and yang for where to live, where to build a house. It's fascinating. So then, if we think about Korea, and it'd be South Korea, North Korea would be different, I suppose. But think about Korea, for instance. We can get to Vietnam in a moment. But in some ways, it seems very westernized to me as an outsider. But how do you think Koreans, like working with Korean youth, naturally think about Jesus? Is there anything that would be kind of distinctively Korean in their approach?
We have more westernized imagery of Jesus.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too, just from the outside. Okay, yeah.
So that's why we have some difficulties to reach out non-Christian.
Okay. So say more about that. Why is that a difficulty?
Well, in Korean case, we have half of population which don't have any religion,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
but we are just growing up in like total confusion and
Confusion? Yeah.
and Buddhist culture.
Oh, Confucianism. Okay, so it's like in the culture, in the air, the way we would say that. Okay.
So I researched again that when the Buddhism came into Korea, it was in 4th century.
Wow. Okay.
So it's kind of Christianity has been grown up in the European countries.
Yeah. Wow.
So we cannot ignore the culture.
Yeah. Did it come from China, or from the
Yes.
sea? From China. Yeah. But it's experienced as, this is a question, is it experienced as Buddhism, as a, let's say in his category, indigenous, natural Korean religion? It's not experienced as a Chinese import.
Yeah.
It's natural, yeah. So the question would be, how can we as Christians do the same thing? Yeah. Fascinating.
I think that's an interesting, because Dick's fan that talks about Buddhism being Pan-Asian,
Yes.
so that it's different from some of those other ones where there's sort of more localization. But Buddhism has kind of spread across multiple cultures,
It's pretty amazing, isn't it?
And-
Yeah.
which would be relevant to Christianity if we talk about Christianity.
Yep,
It's
that's right.
multiple cultures.
Yep. And how to be, I mean, Tibetan Buddhism is different from,
Yeah, there might be
Chinese
all
and-
variations.
It's
But
like
yeah.
Protestantism and Catholic.
yeah, right.
Things like
But they're still,
But
they all self-identify as Buddhist,
Still
yeah.
an underlying Buddhist kind of
Very different
worldview.
Yeah, right. And in practice and approach, yeah, okay. Fascinating, okay.
Take, just one example.
Yeah,
of,
please.
Rites, the rituals, because the ritual is very the model of enculturation.
Mm-hmm.
So when we think about enculturation, we usually think when you have a mass, we have to use like Korean music, or so that's the way of usually people think.
Right,
But I think we have another case of enculturation because we have already a ritual which is quite Confucian,
yes, good.
but we do this ritual in a Catholic way. We
Fascinating.
cannot abandon this ritual at all.
Yeah,
I think that's a good.
that's very good. That's very helpful, Catherine, thank you. And I mean, maybe an example, there's probably better ones. Those of you who've been in history and sources and liturgists and so on. But, for instance, the Catholic use of saints some would argue, I'm not in a position to rule on this, but it seems reasonable, that this was in part, I mean, part of it was just remembering holy people, okay? But some of the ritualization was also related to the house gods that were common in Roman culture, and they would each have these small gods, not known that widely. They represent a city or this or that, and they'd have this. And so the Catholics, rather than fight it, transformed it into saints, and it came to function the same way. They made clear the saints aren't God, and made all the necessary qualifications. But it was a case of working with this practice that was already there rather than getting rid of it all. And in some ways, to me, that's the Catholic way. We tend to do that more than some Protestant churches who are more interested in getting rid of all that, and this is all idolatry. And I mean, they'd say, I suppose with some truth, we're a little too wishy-washy. I think there's a better way to describe it. But, I mean, it's a way of working with what's there and purifying it of false understandings, but letting it feed what people have been fed by here. Kind of recognizing people have been honestly fed by the Spirit through these rituals. Why should we kill them all? Not the people, the rituals. Why should we get rid of them all? Yeah. In today's world, I need to be real clear on it. Right. Excellent. That's very helpful. Thank you. Yeah, it's Confucianism. So those would be the two major religions in Korea. And then secularism, people just have nothing. Okay. How about Vietnam?
I think is the one good way he explained here, the way the life of Jesus have something similar with the life Buddha,
Okay.
because Buddha came from a king.
Yes.
He did not know his position of his king, and he went out to and fight the way to release the poor.
Yes.
So the good way to be to live with the people that is become a monk.
Yes. Right.
So and Catholic when Jesus also divine, so it's like a king.
A king.
From God. So he go down into the human being. So he walk with the people. So he save the poor people, or heal the sick.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So that's very good way. He said we can incorporate that way. So, because like in Korea, Buddhism is very influenced in our country.
Okay. Yeah.
Almost people know about it. So that is one way we can.
Okay. So people who aren't even Buddhists
Right.
know the Buddhist story and the Buddhist
Right.
way of doing things. Okay.
Yeah, and another way we incorporate like with the pagans, they have like New Year's.
Okay, yeah.
We celebrate 3 days. The first day, daytime, the god that is like the sun, or some
Oh, yeah, okay.
and
smart.
the second day is, they give thanks to the ancestor.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
the third day is for sanctificate, for the work of the years,
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sanctification.
Right,
Yeah.
for the years. So we incorporate all these days. So the first day we thank God for all things. The second day we ask people to go to cemetery to pray for their ancestors, and the third
Yes.
day thank God, ask God for the new crops and all that things. So we can.
I
all that
see,
things,
yes.
so it's wonderful thing.
That's what. Yeah.
It's often just when the from beginning some Jews from European they came to our country. At that time all people they worship their parents.
Oh. Yeah.
So, the missionary they said we have to put down all your ancestors because they are creatures. Not, God.
Okay.
So they said no, go away because they cannot do it.
Yeah.
So, but later on, they came back and then to find another way, said, they allowed people to leave their ancestors, altar there. But they said put God in the, in the top because God who creates.
Sure.
Right, like your ancestors worship the God above them. So now is the one who's above them, that is we call that God. So we can put God there and the
Fascinating.
ancestors here. So they said, okay, that's,
Right.
that work.
That's good. No, that's so helpful. And it's interesting because, and I have this sense that the role of ancestors, we in the West are more the anomaly here. It seems like in almost every other culture, because there's a big issue in Africa, that was, Cook was saying this, to see Jesus as ancestor is going to be critical to making sense of Jesus in a native way in Africa. And very similar to what you were saying, there's also a critique, though. Because remember, Cook was saying that one of the big challenges is these ancestors are tribally understood. And they justify tribal violence, even, and competition. And so for the church to teach that all tribes have one ancestor, this is a radical idea to them and is news. So this was a great example of how we can adopt things from the culture, but also critique those things that are in fact contrary to the gospel. Like adopt certain things about, I don't know, from cultures on social status, but draw the line at slavery. For instance, just as an example, and we need to be both accepting and critical. So this whole idea of figuring out how to be accepting of the role of ancestors, while also taking away the idea that you worship your ancestors, becomes very significant. And again, like what we do as Catholics with saints is very much in that spirit. How many times haven't you had, even still in all the ecumenism, conversations where you have to explain to Protestant friends that we don't actually pray to saints the way we pray to God. And veneration is, but what we're trying to do is these are in some ways our ancestors who we recognize as somehow related to the whole relationship to God, but in a particular way. And that's exactly what you've done. I mean, it's fascinating, really fascinating.
Another thing is, in the past, the church didn't allow the people to incense, the ancestor.
Okay.
But
Didn't
now-
allow them to what?
Ancestor, incense.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Right, but now the church allowed it because that's the act of culture, not a worship.
Yes.
So that now is we can do both. Incense
So how
and culture.
we can
The ancestor.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, yeah, we sort of bring the censer around at Mass to everybody,
Yeah.
not just the altar.
Right.
So, and we believe in the communion of saints, so why not the dead? Incense the dead as well. Fascinating. But there's a lot of listening. Now, you deal a lot with Native Americans, right? In your,
Somewhat, for the homeless people.
okay, do you think about this I mean, it's not the same, but it's a similar way, different culture, and how to make the gospel relevant to them?
Well, as far as working with the faith, it's more the Southeast Asian people.
Oh, okay.
And it's already been brought to them, so it's more like seeing how that happened and just kind of taking it in.
Okay. Are they Hmong that you worked with, or?
I didn't work with them as much, more the Burmese.
Okay. Oh, yeah, you mentioned that from Burma. Wow. Yeah. Okay. Fascinating. And this is, yeah, I mean, the other thing, talk about this in terms of the global Catholic Church. The global church also lives in our neighborhood. It isn't just someplace, what are you, 14,000 miles away? However far it is. It's also, 50. It's here, and how do we deal with these folks? Or in St. Cloud, the whole issue with Somalis, some of whom are Christian. Most of the ones here, I think, are Muslim, but there are Somali Christians, but yet they have practices that are very different than ours. Yeah. Fascinating. Excellent. Any other comments or questions on that? Yeah.
Does Jesus, is there art and iconography, is that enculturated in a sense? Do you have different images for Jesus?
Yeah, in the past, we did not use to wear the Vietnamese or native
Faces, yeah.
faces. All the image and style are in Western culture and theme. But now we turn to very Vietnamese tradition that Virgin Mary wear the dress.
Oh.
Vietnamese dress.
Okay.
It's a no bear at all with a very baby face.
Okay, yeah, okay, interesting.
And that work for many non-Christian.
Yeah.
Because they said that in the past we is acquired by colonized foreign.
Yes.
Colonized,
French.
Yeah,
colonized religion.
Yes, right,
So-
good, very good.
So they deny all things that related with colonized.
Yes,
That is the big thing with the Catholic, and that is the bad time that the king persecute all the Christian in Vietnam.
okay,
And thanks to for the Vatican II that we have dialogue with another religion and the culture. That
Yeah.
We turn to the architect of churches.
Okay.
Or all things in Vietnamese tradition. The church like a pagoda.
oh, church like a pagoda,
Uh-huh.
yeah,
And the altar like the altar that pagan worship in the earth or the sun or something like that.
yeah,
So that means we turn to we take root in our culture and non-Christian accept it.
fascinating, excellent, a very good
Like
question.
the architecture.
Yeah, right. Well, because, a basilica is a Roman civil structure. And it's fine. I mean, I like basilicas, but you shouldn't think that somehow they fell from heaven as a design. So a pagoda would be good. Yeah, that's excellent, very helpful. There's a church near Jerusalem, at least in Israel. I could look it up, but this particular church, they have images of Mary.
Annunciation.
Yes.
This is in Nazareth,
Okay.
for each country.
For each country, and they are ethnically specific to that country.
Yeah.
It's a fabulous thing to walk through there and see this is how this works, and how to see Mary, for instance, and the same thing with Christ. Yeah, how to see Christ in these different images, because as the reconstruction showed, our art is pretty Western and not necessarily historically authentic to the person of Christ. And I have to tell you, one time I did a whole half class on the art. It was fun, but I have these mixed feelings about this. But I remember, okay, so I also, I really like the whole idea of contemporaneity, right, from the fragments that we read, and who's the real contemporary, and the real contemporary is the believer, and okay. So the historical Jesus is important to me in all kinds of ways, which argues for a certain kind of authenticity in the art to the first century. All right. But I remember being in a museum, and the first time I was struck by this, I was way older. I should have thought of this before, but it was an image of the crucifixion from some 16th century Dutch kind of painting, right? Really nice. I love that stuff. But it was like the crucifixion outside some Dutch city. The soldiers dressed in uniforms of the time. It was totally historically naive. But I thought, theologically, this is right on, because it suggests that the people we know, people like you and me, were the soldiers and the people in the crowds shouting, "Crucify him." And so the lack of historical preciseness made us contemporary. And sometimes history, which talks about the historical Jesus and the human Jesus and all this, can have a context of placing Jesus at a distance. He's different. The people who killed him are different. We would never do that because we're this, that, and the other thing. And it can have a way of creating a distance. So making the art both culturally and historically relevant, making Jesus look like somebody I might meet on the street, can have a pretty powerful effect, I think. Okay, I want to wrap up with one last comment here from, well, then, maybe before that, any questions, not that this, I didn't overly dramatize this, it's not that great, but questions on the Islam piece? I mean, a couple things that may be news, and part of this, it's theologically different. It just seemed like something we should be aware of, given everything, especially like today. But Jesus is mentioned in the Quran 93 times, he says. And it's complimentary, very affirming of Jesus, which can be a great thing for Muslim proselytizing of Christians, because it can seem so positive. And you can almost hear people saying, and then there's that whole Trinity thing. It's so confusing anyhow. Just get rid of that. We don't need the Trinity. There's just one God. There aren't three gods. Okay, well, we don't believe there's three gods either, but okay. And then Jesus isn't divine. And related to that, they believe that the Gospels were corrupted somehow, so they're not historically accurate. They don't believe that Jesus dies on the cross, because that's too demeaning for a holy one, which is pretty interesting. I mean, when you compare the life history of Muhammad and the life history of Jesus, they're quite different, and how this works. And so the dying on the cross is problematic, and I don't want to rub anybody's face in anything, but it does make me think, yes, and this is very important to us. I mean, the cross, quite apart from all the critique we might have of Anselm or how hard it is to figure out as I said, the mechanism of salvation and all that, okay, all that, fine. I'm not taking any of that back, but I feel like I can put that in a box, and the point is, the cross and the death on the cross are incredibly significant to Christian self-understanding. And that is precisely one of the points that Islam has a problem with. And how we deal with that for mutual understanding and so on is very significant, but doesn't mean we get rid of it. It's just very, very central.
Well, the Greeks had a problem with it too.
What's that?
The Greeks had a problem with it too.
Yeah, that's true. They did, yes. And it is, how can God die on the cross? I mean, this just makes no sense. Okay, well, the one thing I just wanted to highlight was really something that we'd said before, but both of them, but Fawn does this the best, I think. Let me pull this out. Where am I at? Here it is. On 424, back to the same place where we just were, right above that quote, where he talks about adequacy and appropriateness. So I don't want to leave the impression we're dealing with enculturation and all these things we've been doing these last few weeks, that the only criteria is it acceptable or does it fit in the culture? And that's come out from the very comments here about the practices of how we critique and so on. But Fawn gives a nice little methodology for this. So he says, the four Christologies we have discussed are but samples of the many portraits, etc. Because they are all Christian theologies, two broad set of criteria can be applied to assess their validity. So are these valid or are these good theologies? Namely, adequacy and appropriateness. By adequacy is meant the power to speak the Christian word in the contemporary idiom in order to understand and transform the condition of the addressee. In other words, does this make sense to the people we're talking with? Koreans, Vietnamese, Africans, whatever, okay? So is it authentic to their culture? But that's not enough. We also need, what he says, appropriateness, which is meant the relative coherence of this message with the life and teaching of Jesus as mediated through the Bible and Christian tradition. So it needs to be consistent with the Bible, consistent with Revelation, but also speak to the culture. And that can mean some fairly radical changes. Breaking the pot. He goes right from there to that image about we need to break the pot. But not every fruit produced is valid. So then on 430, he applies this in an interesting way. This would be the second paragraph up from the bottom. He says, in general, it must be said, and this, that a cavalier dismissal of patristic and medieval Christologies, which could be very easily done. I mean, they're so Eurocentric, they're so Greek, they're so this, that, and the other thing. So male, so clerical, all that stuff. Okay. Cavalier dismissal would impoverish Asian Christology. I think that's a fascinating way to put it. His point here at the moment is not that it would be untrue to the past, it abandons tradition. No. He says this would impoverish Asian Christology by neglecting the genuine insights of these older Christologies, and ignorance of them would severely limit the possibility of dialogues between Western and Eastern theologies, which is more necessary now than ever before. Not least, a thorough knowledge of them may spare Asian Christology the mistakes and deficiencies for which Asian theologians have criticized Western Christology, so we can learn from the past. But, so he wants us to know the tradition. So this, in a way, is an apology for the course, right? But he wants us to know the tradition because it is our tradition, but also because it will help those developing indigenous theologies to do so in a better way. That it'll be a richer Asian theology if they're in dialogue with patristic and medieval Western theology. But I think we'd also have to say, now, Western theology will likewise be richer if we are in dialogue with indigenous Asian theology. We will all have a better understanding of how God is at work in the world through Jesus Christ by letting each of us develop these Christologies and then talking to each other in one church. I think that's where we have to go. All right, well, thank you very much. And